It's something. Okay, let's just wait for that. There we go. So welcome everyone to the June 9, 2021. So I guess for any of you who live in a world where you align your financial year to the Microsoft financial year, I guess you're almost approaching your end of financial year. So happy New Year in advance to your quack.
Yeah, thanks, man.
And may your FY22 kickoff be as fulfilling as always.
From hero back to zero.
Okay, so we've got a few regulars. We've got some new people on board today. So I'll just do a quick introduction. My name's Mark O'Shea. You can find me on Twitter at InTunedIn, and we've got Ben as well. So Ben, over to you quickly.
Hi, I am Ben from the internet. You can find me on Twitter at powers_hell, I think. I don't know. Yeah. I'm on things.
Did you get the stuff ready that I asked you to get ready for this?
Totally.
No. I'll do this one completely. Don't worry. I'm not putting any pressure on you at all for this one.
Listen, I'm in lockdown. Give me a break.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, like all those things that you can't go out and do.
Exactly.
Like what would happen if you broke a guitar string during lockdown? You just have to wait for it to get delivered.
I mean, I would go into the pile of pre-purchased guitar strings, obviously.
Yes.
I planned for this stuff.
That would make a lot of sense.
If it's a hobby, I'm prepared. If it's for like a professional career, no, I'm not ready.
Yeah, it's like, oh no, I don't have any spare SSDs, but yeah, I've got 400 different guitar strings.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so just to go through the agenda, we are having a pretty focused Azure AD session today, primarily to cover off what's changed with conditional access over the last year. Now, the reason why I thought this one was important was when I was sort of thinking about things that we've been saying we need to sort of revisit this topic. Azure AD, conditional access in particular falls into this category because I think every month over the last year, there's been something new that's gone GA or something new that's gone into preview for conditional access. And we've sort of spoken about it for a minute or two and then said, yeah, we really need to go into this stuff in a lot more detail. Now, here we are a year later, and I was actually fairly shocked when I went through and started putting this together because I was thinking maybe there'll be 3 or 4 slides of stuff we'll talk about. And no, there is a hell of a lot more than that. So we'll talk about some of the use case scenarios and how that might impact some of the things you've been doing already, or some of the problems that some of these new updates are going to solve. Now, some of the things that we've got in here were announced recently and don't seem to be in the Azure AD What's New description pages yet. So maybe they'll go into the next update. But as we go through all of this stuff, I'll have links for everything so we can drop it in so that if you want to dig in and take a bit more of a look at it, we can do that. Now, I can see Phil's joined. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you, Mark. Always feels welcome in a meetup when you get greeted. So thank you for that. I'll put that in the feedback.
So I guess just the first one here, first thing to kick off with is just if there's like the first section we normally go through is if there's anyone new who either wants to unmute and do an introduction, or if you're a little bit microphone shy, please jump into the chat window. Now, it's not a huge group this month, so let's sort of make this one fairly interactive. I'm sure there'll be some quite a few questions on some of the things that we do go through. But if you are new and you just want to sort of mention why you're here, if you haven't joined before, etc., please feel free to do that. Now, just to sort of go through what the agenda is, just a few, not too many, just general Azure AD updates. Just a couple of the key ones that were made, announcements that were made at the RSA conference last month. I just thought we'd sort of focus on a couple of things because everything else is going to be what's new and improved in a component of Azure AD. So we'll start off with the features that are still in preview. Now, something to watch out for here when you are working with conditional access. How many of you are mostly using endpoint, the endpoint admin center to go through and manage your conditional access policies. So how many of you are doing it primarily from there?
Show of hands, if anyone's doing that.
Okay, so what you will see here is a lot of these preview features don't light up in, well, either you can't even enable them through Endpoint Manager because it's not necessarily something that's being exposed through the CA UI. It might be something that's coming through security settings or something like that. So there are a few things that you'll see that I'll do just a bit of a comparison so that you can see that there are some fairly major differences in terms of the preview features that light up. Now, I wish I could just say something as simple as if it's a preview feature, it's not in Endpoint Manager, but it is. But there's very few preview features in Endpoint Manager as far as CA goes. But once we get over into like portal.azure.com or aad.portal.azure.com, that's where a lot of these preview features do start lighting up. So then we'll go through some of the, I think most, if not all of the new conditional access features that have gone, that are generally available. So basically, what is it that's supported? What is it actually supported isn't really the big issue. It's what is actually released and has an SLA applied to it. And then just to sort of wrap things up a bit, we'll sort of drop back into the security defaults just to set the stage for the next part, which is the common conditional access policies. So these are just some of the general guidelines that you'll see from Microsoft around, here's a good starting point for things that you probably should be thinking about. Now, the reality here is that a lot of what you'll get through these common conditional access points are fairly straightforward, and you're probably already doing some, if not most of them already, if you are already working with CA. But a lot of the new preview features, a lot of the more recent GA features, you'll find that they're just not really covered in these just yet. So Kwok even knows the articles that I'm talking about here. I haven't even shared the link, the resource link document with him, and he's basically pulling out all the ones that I wanted to cover off.
He's a really good assistant. I can't believe you got him on board.
I know, I don't even have to pay him.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't think so. Yeah, so if anyone does want to just sort of drop into chat or unmute themselves just to do a quick introduction, if you haven't joined previously, please feel free to do that. But if you don't feel like it, that's no problem either. Just so that we've got a bit of an idea of who's here, like why you're here, etc.
Let me get started. Sorry.
Yeah.
Hey, Pratik Dave from Melbourne. I have been joining this session on and off, and I think it's a lockdown, so I thought let me make most of it.
Yeah.
And I'm currently contracting with Datacom, and I work in Microsoft 365 space, majorly Intune, Conditional Access, Azure AD. So they're all very close to my heart, and all Defender, security, etc.
Awesome.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, guys.
And do we have anyone else? We've got Jesse typing in.
I want to know who Man of Steel is.
That's Clark Kent, but with an E at the end of Clark and an E at the end of Kent.
I mean, I'm aware of that. That's that's the obvious.
No, Man of Steel is Michael Steele.
Yeah.
Hi, Michael.
With an E at the end of steel.
Yes, with the E at the end of steel.
Steely.
So yes, for those that don't know me, I'm Michael. I was one of the people that started this up again with Mark and Steve. I am a systems architect at Fujitsu Australia and work with this stuff on a daily basis. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Nice.
And you've made it.
And I've made it for a change, yes.
Yeah.
And
Well, now,
Jess,
so now there's one of your former co-workers is now living very close to me. So we're threatening to have lunch with each other maybe once a year or so. You know, we can't do it too often.
Oh, really? And who's that?
Oh, I'll send you details.
Okay.
we're being recorded.
Yeah.
We've
Not
got
allowed to give. We can only give away my personally identifiable information, not other
exactly.
people's.
Exactly.
Fair enough.
And
Yep.
we've got a new attendee, Jesse Marsh, who's also from Melbourne. I'm guessing we're going to have a lot of people from Melbourne because the lockdown version 4 is nowhere near as fun as version 1, 2, and 3. So yeah, welcome, Jesse.
Okay, so Jesse, can I work on an assumption that you work for a CSP and Microsoft 365 Business Premium is the primary product you're working with? Would that be a good assumption? Or two assumptions? Let's see. Am I guessing things correctly here?
Well, he's typing very quickly, so I reckon you're right.
Yeah.
There we go.
There we go. That's a good combination.
Nailed it.
Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. I won't ask which RMM solutions you were working with previously, because there's probably only 2 or 3, and we probably shouldn't really bring them up. Just let them fade off into whatever it is that they're obscurity.
What's the term? Sunsetting?
I was going to say fade into the sunset, but then
exactly.
Yeah, if for some people they're joining where the sun's coming up, so maybe it's not good. Okay, so let's just talk about some just a couple of, or not a couple. There's 3, but there's really 2 things that I want to talk about here. So AAD updates you may have missed. Now, the first one's not actually AAD, but it's close enough that we get to include it. And the first thing here is that they've changed the Sentinel connector for Azure AD now, so that you don't need AAD premium licenses if you aren't ingesting the sign-in logs. Now, if any of you have been working in this UI over the last month or so, you might have started noticing a little bit of weirdness around it. And I'll just sort of walk you through where it is right now. If we just jump down here to data connectors, and okay, this is good. I was really hoping that would show 6 instead of 5, because I've been waiting for it to turn over. It takes a while. But down here, you can see that I've got Azure AD selected. But I guess before we do that, let's just show that there's nothing up my sleeve here. I just want to show with this tenant, this is just an Azure AD free tenant. So it's just got a bunch of Azure subscriptions dumped into it. No AAD additional licensing added in. So if we take a look in here, it should say Azure AD free. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that one first of all, because previously, if you had Azure AD free, but you didn't have, and you wanted to use Sentinel, you couldn't just go through and enable any kind of connectivity directly into Azure AD. Now, what they've done here instead is, if we jump in and take a look at the connector, this is basically telling you, let's ignore these bottom pieces here because I don't have those selected. But this is these first 2, the sign-in logs not being enabled, but audit logs being enabled. That's the important piece. So those of you who've seen this UI previously, you probably remember that under prereqs, it listed as a 4th option, as the 4th item that was required, was that you needed to have Azure AD Premium P1 or P2. But you can see that that's now been removed. So there was a period a couple of weeks ago where that was removed, but they weren't actually really giving any additional details about what the change was. So it was almost like they sort of, something sort of snuck through a little bit too early. But what you can see once we scroll down a bit further, and I'll just zoom in a bit down here, it's basically saying if we want to export the sign-in data, we need Azure AD P1 or P2. but you can see here that I've got audit logs enabled. Now, based on what we can see once I jump over and show you another component here, I've only selected audit logs just to sort of try to get something up and running quickly, but I think we can still go through and enable these pieces. So even though the wording here is talking about, in order to export sign-in data, they're specifically talking about the Azure AD sign-in data, not these other sign-in log types that you've got down here. So the wording is still fairly confusing, I think, but where you can really start to see where this will make sense is if we just jump back to that Azure AD page and come down to, it doesn't matter, sign-ins or audit logs will take us to pretty much the same locate or the same page once we get into the diagnostic settings here. But once we're in diagnostic settings, they really clear up what you can and can't import if you don't have Azure AD Premium. So if we just take a look in here, what you can see here is that sign-in logs is the only one that you can't select if you don't have a P1 or P2 license. So all of those other sign-in logs, so 1, 2, 3, so there's 4 other sign-in logs that are supported, as well as the non-sign-in logs, but it's just the primary sign-in log. So if that's not confusing, or if you don't think has got the ability to make people think something is or isn't supported that's not there. So I just sort of went through it, and it was only by accident that I thought to check this to see this, and this is actually the best place to get that clarification. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that if somebody does, because I guess it's one of those things where if we're at something like this where the focus is on M365, where we can work on the assumption that everyone's got, or I'd like to work on the assumption that everyone's got Azure AD Premium, you sort of think, well, surely everyone can choose that option. Now, but it's like, well, even here, this is kind of a bit broken because I can still hit apply changes here and it will actually accept it, but I won't get that data through. So this is what I mean by they've made some changes, but it doesn't seem like it's fully baked just yet. So Croc, I'll get you to raise an issue for that one for me and say, could they just sort of fix it for me? Or Phil, you or Phil, I don't care which of you gets on it for me. But it's just a little bit of a weird one because I can see from the way that it looks at the moment, it's almost like it's saying you really shouldn't check this box if you don't have P1 or P2, but it lets you do it anyway, even though that data won't come through. Now, one other thing I just want to quickly show you while we're in here, or actually a couple of other things I want to show you down here is, so first of all, in this tenant, because I do have the VMs that I've got in here do have Azure Defender for servers enabled on them. That means, so basically I've got Azure Defender. That also means though that I do get, where are we? Down here somewhere. Let's just do a search for Defender. The downside of more connectors means that you have to scroll further. If we just jump into this Microsoft 365 Defender preview and we jump in and take a look at what's in here, then this is where you can see that it's actually allowed me to connect into Defender for Endpoint. Now, the reason why I just wanted to highlight this one is sometimes when you're getting Defender for Endpoint, but you don't have any Defender licenses in your tenant. So in this case, like I don't have Defender licenses in the tenant. So if we jump back to Azure AD again and we take a look at what is it that I've actually got licenses for, then there's not going to be anything in here that I've got licenses for. So like absolutely nothing. Whereas let's just do a compare and contrast. If I jump over to this one, come into Azure AD, licenses, and all products. You can see here that this is showing me everything that I've got included. Whereas, because this is, so basically this is an M365 tenant as opposed to really being an Azure tenant, even though they one and the same thing. But yeah, so just to sort of highlight here that when you do enable Defender for server, you do get the Defender licenses for the Windows Server VMs. I don't think Windows Client VM licenses in Azure are covered though. They might be, but it'd kind of be an expensive way to license the client side. So I think it's more that it just doesn't really make sense to license the clients that way, unless you just want it to be Azure costs versus M365 licensing. Now, the other thing to watch out for here is just watch the thing in this case is depending on, like those of you who work for Microsoft partners or any of you who are MVPs or trainers or things like that, depending on when you were given your different Azure subscriptions, the chances are that you might have some that you could only, at the time, you could only redeem them against a Microsoft account, not against an Azure AD account. So the thing that I have to do with this one is whenever I want to have a look at the Defender for Endpoint reporting here, I actually need to sign in with a different admin account because I can't sign in with just that default Microsoft account. It just gets a bit, a little bit messy here, but that's just kind of a legacy hangover of Microsoft. But not having an ability, or they can move my subscriptions across. There's no technical issue. The issue is they can't move my subscriptions across, but keep the free monthly offers in place on them. So in other words, no, they can't actually do it in a way that's satisfactory. Now, just another little bit of a weird one, and I don't know if Phil or Kwok have got any kind of insight into this one, but when you do enable Defender for Server or Azure Defender for Servers, you get on your Windows Server VMs, you do get Defender for Endpoint, but I don't think the last time I looked, you didn't actually get Defender for Linux, Defender for Endpoint for Linux. You actually got a third-party solution. Do either of you know anything about that?
That's a good one. I know you get the license to run on the Linux box, but whether the tech is Microsoft crafted or third-party, that's a good one.
Well, so that's the thing that, so my thought on it, based on having no factual information, but just based on the way the world works, is like maybe there's just like, maybe there are some, maybe the way that Microsoft has licensed certain components for Defender for Endpoint for Linux, maybe they can only supply it through certain channels, and maybe doing it through Azure or Defender for Endpoint or Azure Defender for Servers may not actually meet that requirement. So anytime there's something weird like that, I just assume there's some kind of weird third-party licensing issue involved. So even if it's still completely, it is a Microsoft in-house solution, maybe there's still some third-party licensing involved in components, which no doubt there would be. So that's my assumption, but I'll see if I can dig it up and find out, because in some of the the Defender documentation, Azure Defender documentation, it caught me by surprise because I just assumed it would be the Linux agent, for Defender. I didn't think that it would be something else.
It's a good question, Mark. I know there's a heavy open source focus in the business at the moment, and I would presume that there may be implications around GNU and all that sort of stuff in whatever technology they've picked up.
Now, I'll probably get a chance to play around with some of this stuff firsthand soon. And let me just switch back to one other thing I wanted to show you. This is probably going to be exciting to some of you and of no interest to others of you. Just in Sentinel, one of the things that was added in recently was this solutions section where so the solutions offerings themselves are preview, but the solution category is preview. And the thing in here that got my attention, for reasons that will make sense in just a moment, is there is now a Unify solution in there. So do any of you have any Unify / Ubiquity gear?
You think I'm made of money?
That doesn't get spent on guitars. Okay, so any of you who do work with who do work more with maybe, going back down to maybe, working in the SMB space and you're looking at the Ubiquity gear versus, Cisco or, some of the other solutions there. But this is something that is actually going to not force me, but strongly encourage me to actually set up a Linux VM so I can put the Azure or the Microsoft monitoring agent onto it, so I can start pushing the syslog info through from the Ubiquity controller into that syslog appliance and then into Sentinel. So, but I'm not going to do that in my main tenant just yet because I don't know how much it's going to cost because it is Sentinel. And it's a network solution, which is making me think there's a potential for a lot of data to start getting. Sure. So Jerome, so I think it was actually your post. I think you posted about this and I bookmarked it going, I'd better take a look at this. And then the problem that I had was I didn't realize it was here in this solutions category. And I was just looking in data connectors going, where's Unify? Why isn't it in here? So I'm thinking maybe I'll set it up just on one of the other, on a demo tenant for a while, just to see what the ingestion costs are like when I don't have anything else that's going to impact pricing in there. But so that means that I'll get to test a bit more of that. What actually, if I have Defender for Servers monitoring that same Linux VM, at least that way I can sort of dig a bit further into what it is that Azure Defender's actually using there. So Jerome, we can share notes. Actually, I'll bounce a few. I'll reach out to you afterwards because I know where I'm going to struggle is on the Linux VM side. That's something where, like any of you who do work with Linux, be prepared for me to be asking you some really, really dumb questions. That's a promise.
I can help you out with that, Mark.
Oh, good, Ben. I've got lots of dumb questions for you.
I got lots of dumb answers, so it's fine.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to show that one because I just thought for some of you, basically this is an audience where things like Ubiquity gear are either things that you might be using at work or that you have been tempted to purchase from home because you thought overkill was the best answer to everything. Okay, so now the next two are closely related. So the first one is the Azure AD login for Windows VMs in Azure. So if someone wants to, sign in via RDP, and basically for me, like if we sort of take a look at it, it's, the things that we need to sort of remember here, and this is where we sort of have to make sure people understand what's happening here. So the Win 10 side, I think that's fairly straightforward. But where things get a bit confusing with Server 2019 is people going, oh, so does that mean my on-prem Win Server 29 VMs can do an Azure AD join? No, they can still do Azure AD registration, but they can't do Azure AD join. And the other thing as well here that I think also has the potential to cause confusion is people sort of intertwining Azure AD join with auto enroll into Intune. So of course, Win 10 can do that. I think I've got an audience that knows that, but Windows Server does not support MDM. And whenever someone says, well, why doesn't it? A good answer is not many people have mobile servers. And that's what the first M in mobile device in MDM stands for. Yeah. And this is one that if you go all the way back to when Intune was still in preview, and it was an agent-based solution. Even though Windows Server wasn't technically supported, you could install that agent onto Windows Server and it worked. But that was 2011, and it was a completely different product to what it is now. So this is stuff that you look at the things that are happening with WVD, etc. And just around, like when you look at WVD, some of the things that I think it's kind of put a bit of a kick in the pants around some of the things that that Azure storage accounts, etc., and Azure files need to support as well in terms of AD or Azure AD with, I hate saying it, but what is it? The Azure Active Directory domain services, like some of the things that changes that have needed to happen there for so it's not WVD anymore. Remember AVD? Yeah, yes, Azure Virtual Desktop. Yes. which kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
and it
WVD
also-
still is nicer though.
Yeah, AV. Yeah, see, AVD. I've got AVD. That used to mean something very different.
It might still.
Yes, that's probably, yeah. I don't think I'll be saying.
It makes sense. I understand. They're putting it under the. I assume it's Azure Virtual Desktop, so it holds water. But yeah, there's an entire group of people that are obsessed with WVD that now need to pivot.
Rebrand, yes.
I'm sure there's been many domains purchased that are now regretful.
Well, when you do that, like there's always a calculated risk when you do, and maybe my Twitter handle and my blog name is an indication of that. But that's what I would call a strategic move at the time. That is going to hurt at some point in the future, but it made sense at the time. Now, it kind of backfires on people when Microsoft discontinues a product and you've got strong brand recognition alongside that. But I don't think these are things they're discontinuing.
No.
So this one, fairly straightforward. Now, the second one, and I guess we could have even included this as part of the conditional access piece as well, because, hey, CA policies are going to get triggered by this. But the other one now is that you've got pretty much the same benefits of Linux VMs in Azure using Azure AD logins as well. So this is one that do you have I guess if you didn't have a use case for it before, this is the use case. If someone says, well, why would I want to use Azure AD credentials to log into these VMs that aren't being managed by Azure AD? It's like, because I want at least one of these things. Yeah, maybe I just want this. Or if we're doing something in a Linux VM in Azure, we probably also want this as well. So I'd say these two are probably the two big ones out of that.
I'm going to suggest the other major thing that maybe no one is ever going to talk about is that, and I haven't validated this, but potentially this means that you no longer need to do the double authentication method to get into WVD instances.
Yep. So the other thing as well that I was thinking with the Linux VMs is Windows Virtual Desktop becoming Azure Virtual Desktop means that the desktops don't have to be Windows.
Yeah, they're decoupling from the operating system. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Which kind of, when you take a look at other things that have had that name change, like it used to be Windows Azure, it used to be Windows Intune. So moving over to, okay, as a Windows MVP, I should be saying, get rid of the Windows name. But it's one of those things where there are times it makes sense and times it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
We've got Phil typing something in here. I think Phil is about to say that we should just start putting .NET on the end of everything. Yes, good old OS2.
And we all know what that became.
Oh, yes. The first product I did an exam on. Oh, no, hang on. Was OS2 v3 Landman? Yeah, that was the first product I did an exam on. 1993, baby. So I guess I'm not 21 anymore.
You can be if you want to.
Yeah, mentally, I'm not even halfway there yet.
yeah, 13 and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So look, I guess here it's like, so for me personally, like my exposure to Linux is, I don't want to say nil, but it's close enough to nil that it might as well be nil. And Phil probably knows a good reason for this. It was just like if you worked at Microsoft at that time when Linux was starting to gain traction, it was something that at that point in Microsoft's history, it was not something that was being embraced.
Mm-hmm.
Unless embrace means like trying to squeeze the life out of. That's the only kind of embrace that would have been viewed as acceptable at the time. So things have changed. Okay, so Oh, no, I'm getting Phil to dip into his old memory banks now with some of these things. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, Phil, there's somebody that I want to throw under the bus here, but I won't in a recorded session. But I'll
stick around until after we hit.
Afterwards.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. There's someone I'll definitely throw under a bus who threw me under a bus. Oh yeah, we need someone at a roadshow to talk on this thing. Oh, and then a day before, oh no, I'm not the one who's doing it. Phil, does that sound like a product manager you ever worked with? Yes, all of
we're
them.
still recording.
Yes.
Yes.
I could go through a string of names.
No, don't. Because you can probably think of, if it was a Linux compete pitch, there's very few people who would have been in that time frame.
First names only. Terry.
No.
Come on.
Okay, let's move on. Let's pretend that last 2-minute conversation didn't happen.
Right.
So let's jump into some of. I'm not going to say these are all of the preview features. I think it is. I think I've made sure I've tried to grab as many of them as I could, but there's a chance that something may have slipped through the cracks. So the first one here is just in terms of audit logs. Now, there's two parts to this. The first one is we can see what's changed, but the second part is we can basically grab the thing that it was previously via the JSON representation and roll it back to the previous state if we want to. So I guess just being able to see what's changed is kind of a nice thing. But the second part though is just being able to roll back in case it didn't work as expected. So obviously someone forgot to use the what if tool to make sure that things were going to work as expected, or maybe they didn't input the right things into the what if tool. So that one's fairly straightforward. Now the other one here is this one I think still causes a bit of confusion, but it's the user action here, which is, so basically what we're doing here is, if we sort of break it all down, this is one where we're effectively saying that we want to we're basically doing this as a don't apply the policy to devices that we can check their compliance information, or that we can see if they're registered or joined. So in this case, we wouldn't have these unchecked and use it as an allow. If these were checked, we'd basically be trying to block things that weren't in a compliant or a joined state. Now, anytime you see things around the joined devices, should you trust a device just because? Yep. So Jacob, yep, no problem. I'll shoot a link through to you. So with the joined devices, this is one that sometimes I see, because it's not just here, it's also when we're looking elsewhere in conditional access, where we can automatically allow or impose higher allowances or higher permissions on even a device that's Active Directory joined. Sorry, just Active Directory joined, not even AAD joined, because there's an assumption that if you're going to check that box, that you've got something on-prem that's making sure that your devices are compliant, even if you're not relying on Intune to get that info. So just think of this one as it's something that even if you take a look through the wording, and I kept some of it in here. One of the things that seems to be implied in some of the documentation is it seems like this is going to expand for other scenarios over time. So even here, where I've got currently only allows you to enable MFA, blah, 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 that one there is, that's something that is word for word out of some of the text descriptions. So that currently, to me, implies there are bigger plans afoot for this one. Now, the next one is that one of the ones, and I think it was like, was it last year's Ignite or this year's, last year's, which Ignite was it? It was at one of the Ignites that they started talking about the continuous access evaluation. Now, with this one, it basically means we can go through, we can set up that continuous access evaluation. Now, let's just take a quick look at where you actually do that, because it's not, so let's just jump over here. Is it showing up there? No, it's not there. We need to jump into Azure AD, security, and there it is in there, continuous access evaluation. So this is where we can get it to start going through and basically doing more aggressive evaluation of whether it needs to get you to go through and authenticate again if needed. Now, I won't go through and enable it here, but if we just switch back to the slides to talk about what it is here. So here are the three main things so far. So it's the if there's a password change or reset, or a user's terminated, basically trying to get it closer to real time. If someone changes location, basically trying to, if that triggers, it's like, oh, now you're in it somewhere that you need MFA, etc. We can trigger that, and then also the token export. So if a machine's outside of a trusted network, then we can start implementing that. Now, another change that came through, I think, last month. So when it was first released, it was only focused on Exchange, Teams, and SharePoint, but they've added OneDrive in as well. Now, if I hadn't have seen that specific announcement where OneDrive was added in, I probably would have just assumed that it was covered under SharePoint, because I always tend to assume that if they're talking about something compliance or policy related applies to SharePoint, that it probably also applies to OneDrive. But this was a case where it wasn't. And I'm not quite comfortable saying OneDrive yet. I still want to say OneDrive for Business to make sure people know which one I'm talking about, but I think everyone knows which one we're talking about here. Now, I think, was it last month we covered off filters in Endpoint Manager?
Yes. Yeah, because
Well,
that came out last month.
Yeah, and now we've got filters for devices inside of conditional access. So what are these scenarios here? So again, if you weren't on last month's call, we were looking at filters in terms of how we could go through and just create some filtering where we weren't necessarily going through and getting the identity team to create a whole bunch of different dynamic groups for us, for example. Now, in this case, the scenarios that they're really talking about here is when you really want to start controlling specific device types getting access to certain services. So at first, you might be thinking, making sure someone's using the right OS or something like that. But we can already do that we can already do it with CA. What we're talking about here is going through and looking at things like, can we identify which machines are tagged as privileged access workstations, or devices that are reporting in as Surface Hubs, Teams devices, other IoT devices as well. So that way we can basically start putting in additional blocks or allowances based on the actual types of devices, not just the OS that the devices are running. So this one is so I can sort of see this one has got the potential to get some really interesting use cases when you start thinking, especially like when you start thinking about IoT, etc. Like because I think the core, privileged access, Surface Hubs, Teams phones, Teams meeting rooms, that's a fairly limited set of devices. But once you get to the IoT side, that's kind of a crazy number of different device types, form factors, etc., that could roll into that category. So Phil's got to run. So Phil, I'll shoot you a message with the person that they throw somebody under a bus person.
I'm looking forward to getting that unrecorded. Cheers, mate. Bye all. Enjoy. Bye.
Yeah. So with this one, I think this one is, I guess, as long as people aren't trying to use this one to replicate what we could already do by, picking, more commonly used OSs. But in this case, this starts meaning that we get a lot of other. Actually, this is an important one just to do a quick demo of, because this is the perfect example of if I am in Endpoint Manager and we come into CA and let's create a new policy, this one does not show up. So if we jump into conditions here, the only preview one I've got here is device state. But if we jump over to conditional access in the Azure portal, you will see that we do have it in here. So there we go, filters for devices. And if we just take a quick look, no real surprises about what's in here. So device ID, display name, manufacturer, etc. So, so in this case, you can see that there's, pretty much it is, as you'd expect, it's device focused, just like what we saw with the endpoint manager side. So I guess we've basically seen, someone had a good idea and multiple teams said, we have a way of using this in our solutions. Now, for the authentication context, this is one that is, I can see growing. You've got to have a few. This one has got like a few moving parts around it. So this isn't authentication context. Isn't one where you can just come through and say, I want to create that. Now, let's just switch back so we can walk through it a little bit before we come back to the slide. Is it? Just trying to remember, where do we do the initial? It's under CA. Okay, no, so this is one that we can do through Endpoint Manager. So there we go, authentication context. So what we do here is we go through and we start creating these authentication contexts. Now, all these really are just naming schemes for things that we want to use later. So here you can see that they're talking about things like trusted location, trusted device, and strong authorization as examples. And then what we do from here is when we jump back over to CA, if I wanted to create a new policy, instead of going through and saying, I want to assign, I want to create a policy based on the apps. Instead, what we do here is say, I want to do it based on authentication context. So in this case, what we're doing is with that label that we created or that tag that we created and we're using here, then that means we can start using that label can then start being exposed to things like information protection, to CAS, etc. So basically we're telling CAS or information protection whenever this is met. So it might be something based on if you encounter someone trying to open a document with this sensitivity label applied, then this is what you need to do because they've gone from accessing general purpose content up to something that is restricted content, and we really want to make sure it's them. We want to make sure maybe they're coming from a trusted location. So the name that we give it isn't what the power is. The power is that we've created a conditional access policy, and this is basically just the tag that then gets exposed that pulls that policy in. So this is one that, if we really think about who this is going to be more appropriate for, this is really, I think, going to be, a customer who's heavily invested in M365, maybe mostly using most of, if not all of the E5 components. Because if we're talking about, all of the AIP stuff, all of the sensitivity labeling pieces and CAS, that's moving us up towards an E5 conversation anyway. But yeah, so for this one, there's a little bit more involved here, but also you can, basically they've also published, here's what you need to do if you're building your own apps that you want to integrate with this, because they don't want it to just be something that works with Microsoft, because really right now it's really authentication context for Office 365 workloads. Like I wouldn't even say it's a Microsoft 365 focused thing, it's really Office 365 protection that it's offering here. Because I remember when they were talking, because they announced that at one of the recent Ignites, but they didn't really go into much detail about how you configured it or how it worked. But now that information is out there.
Okay.
Now, so the next part then is you can enable in the new when you're setting up a new location, you can now choose the drop-down to determine, basically to check the GPS of the device. So obviously, the first thing you have to think there is, does my device have GPS capabilities there? Because I'm not sure how well, actually, no, it would have to be an iOS or Android device. And the reason for that is that it's the way that it can check your data, your location. It's actually Authenticator that will reach out and say, we need to check that you are, it's not just that you are who you say you are, but it's also that you are within regions that you're allowed to actually access this content. So, yep, so this one is, yeah, an interesting one, and that also that it ties into Authenticator. And I can see with this one, like, Authenticator is kind of turning into a bit of a Swiss Army knife. And I mean Swiss Army knife in a good way, not Swiss Army knife in a bad way. So yeah, because, like, how many of you are using Authenticator to start doing password management?
I was just about to say that. I just reset my mobile device and put Authenticator back on, and it started offering me to do password management. Crazy. Yeah.
So I think there's going to be, it's going to be interesting to see what else they sort of get into it now. But it's basically they're doing a good job now of getting you to go, well, why should I use Microsoft Authenticator instead of Google Authenticator? And yeah, basically passwords, so password sync from browsers, passwordless, the 2-digit code, as well as now the GPS integration. So this is something that, yeah, definitely making some steps in the right direction with it. Okay, now we'll move on to some of the things that have hit general availability. Now, I don't know how many of you are going to be overly amazed by all of these, but the first one here is one that and this is probably just more of a general, like, as you complaint that I see occasionally is let's just say that sometimes it can be a little bit inconsistent where people might expect to see IPv6 support and then they'll go to use something else that they think is closely related where there's no IPv6 support. So now you do have IPv6 support in here, and they've really started to, so Simon, so there's a combination of places. I went through the current and the archived versions of the AAD updates page. And then some of them are things that are just still in blog posts, some recent blog posts that haven't been pulled in yet. But I think the combination of the identity blog and what's new in AAD should have all of these. But I've got the links to everything in here. So at the end, I'll just drop all the links into chat so that you've got them.
Cool.
Now, other things in here, being able to start doing things like searching and sorting and filtering, even with conditional access policies themselves now, I think you can actually do some filtering and sorting on those because people are, they're basically, the number has blown out over the last few years. Now, the next actually, oh no, so, okay, so this one, the require app protection policy grant. So this is when, so let's take a look at this one. There's two somewhat related, but sometimes conflicting policies that you could implement here, or conditions you could implement. Let's just jump, actually, is it under session? Yeah, it's conditional access app control. Okay, no, that's CAS, sorry. Place. Here we go. So we've got these two. We've got the require the approved client app and the require app protection policy. Now, the way to think about it, generally speaking, is something could be an approved client app, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to protect have an app protection policy from Intune coming across. Now, both of these will basically take you out to the same page. So if we take a look here at the list, what you'll see is that if we, one, oh, hang on. I think, sorry, that other one gives a better list. Okay, so here we go. So here you've got the list of the approved client apps, and look at that. They all come from the same company. But then once we come down to the require app protection policy, you'll see that that's actually a much smaller list. So I guess the thing that you've just got to be careful of here is, do you want them using an approved app? And if so, that may not necessarily support that app protection policy option there as well. Now, once you go down here, you'll see that there are some things where they're saying that you've got to be careful, like when you try to mix and match them with certain apps. But it's, you know, what is it? Kazala, is that still a thing? Well, Skype for Business, we can pretend that's not a thing anymore, but Kazali, wasn't Kazali an AFL player that had a song about him? Ben, you're from AFL territory, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, you're in Melbourne. You wear short shorts.
I do not wear short shorts. I think that's my primary problem.
Yeah.
One of them.
Yeah, so just sort of be careful with these two, because this is another one of those areas where the fact that the two of them sit side by side means that someone might not be paying attention and choose the wrong one, not realizing that that's what's causing the problem in there. Yeah, so that's the other thing here then, is when we do, when you take a look at, so thanks for jumping in on that one. If you take a look here, once we get down to the app protection policy, then these are, look at this, we've got two that don't start with Microsoft. So basically these are all ones that have been built up. So here we go. So they've been using the Intune SDK with policy assurance implemented. So effectively it means that they're not just mobile apps, they're mobile apps that have been built to support certain features here. So so again, the documentation is like, I'm sure it was probably updated recently, but some of this stuff has been, like, I guess at least this required approved client app, that's been around forever. But I could imagine people just assuming that everything on that list must automatically support things on this list. Now, if you think about reasons why even some of the Microsoft things maybe don't apply down here, maybe it's just the wrong part of the dev cycle for that team. Maybe that team doesn't realize they should be doing it. Maybe products are end of lifing and it's not worth the effort. Yeah. Okay, so got a couple more. Now in this one's not strictly CA, but CA makes it easier. Now, I don't know when this actually lit up in the old tenant, or not the old tenant, in the, I called it the classic MFA portal. I don't know what else to call it. Because we can't call it legacy yet. So I'll call it, so I think classic means pre-legacy.
Sure, that's fair.
Then pre-legacy sounds like it's older than legacy. It gets so confusing using computer words. Okay, so all I really wanted to show here was that even the old / current portal for pure MFA has been updated to show 365. Or you could, when you're jumping into the sign-in frequency, so if we just switch back quickly, come down to session, you'll see here that sign-in frequency now allows me to put in 365. Now, I'm just curious, either unmute or drop into, yeah, that's it. Yeah, the good old, it's the old Phone Factor website. So from 2010 or 2011, when Microsoft bought Phone Factor, I could have a fairly educated guess as to what those platforms are running on based on the fact that they have not been moved across. Okay, so the fact that we can now show 365 in here, but just a general question for everyone. What number of days, like I'll assume that you generally aren't working in hours in here, but at least now you can see that if you do have really sensitive workloads, hours could be appropriate. But what kind of numbers are you using or have you seen people using in here with sign-in frequency? And are you doing anything different with BYOD versus corporate issued devices? Or are you just kind of using blanket policies for this stuff?
Jerome said 7 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, now no doubt, like I'm sure if we had anyone working down in Canberra, they'd be going 7 days. Oh no, we get 7 hours. But it's just going to be either vertical or how paranoid or what's happened in the past to those orgs is going to determine some of that. But I think a lot of what you used to see were like defaults at around 30, which I think now people are realizing 30 is probably a little bit too loose. So I won't save that. I don't think I want. Personally, I want 365, but I don't think it's a good idea. Now the next one is a fairly straightforward one, and I think this is probably one of the first things we've spoken about where we've kind of stepped away from just a pure AAD premium conversation to an AAD premium P2. And this is where we're looking at user risk condition. So you've always had sign-in risk condition as part of your, if you had P2 licensing. So let's just sort of take a second to talk about the user risk versus sign-in risk. So sign-in risk is mostly around that current sign-in session, but also what's kind of happened just prior to it. So if it sees things like impossible travel, if it sees that the network that you're coming from has had a whole bunch of unusual activity before you're signing in. So basically it's around the sign-in activity itself mostly. But with user risk, it's generally not something related to the sign-in event itself. It's triggered by something that the user has potentially done previously, such as use the same username and password that they use for work on an external site, and those credentials have leaked, and Azure AD Premium P2's identity protection matched up and said, hey, we can sign in as that user using those leaked credentials. That's basically what this is. So this is more around things where the user account itself is the problem as opposed to the user attempting to sign in. That's the problem here. Right. Now I can see that Pratik is jumping in on this one as well.
Yeah, from experience from the field, sometimes the logs or information shown is not sufficient to see why your sign-in is blocked, or what other legitimate reason that they found the issue, like third-party website, or there's sometimes information missing in there.
Yeah, so especially with what they give, so especially with what they present to an end user, the end user gets, I was about to say something all, which I shouldn't say. The user basically doesn't get any information that will help someone figure out what they need to do to get around it. And even in a lot of the testing recommendations you see from Microsoft, anything around, especially risk-based sign-ins, it's always, use Tor to trigger a medium risk event. Because, I think that's really one of the only things that Microsoft will publicly talk about, because that falls into the category of, the users trying to hide their original location. It doesn't necessarily mean they're doing something wrong, but if someone is legitimately using Tor browser to do anything productive in O365 or M365, I think they've got a very different idea of what being productive is versus most people out there. I like waiting 15 seconds for a screen to refresh as it travels around the world. So in this case, the user risk is, any of you who've already been working with P2, and I guess if you think about what's happening over on the P2, or when you are working with identity protection, you've kind of got like a one size fits all approach there when it comes to the way identity protection works. Whereas I think what this does is we can go through and set up different risk-based policies inside of different conditional access policies. So this finally gives us a lot more flexibility versus that one size fits all that we had over in identity protection itself. Now, the other thing in here, and this was just down at the bottom of where we were a second ago. Can I find it again? Yeah, so down here, the persistent browser session, if we just hover over it, it basically shows us a lot of what's, what's there. But yeah, is it something, there are certain things we need to start putting in place here. So we need to do things such as select all cloud apps, for example, here. So basically, do we want things like the persistent browser session? So if someone's constantly opening and closing the browser session as opposed to just opening something up in a different tab, or it could be just trying to change people's habits. But this way you can go through and start putting in some of the different options here. But you can see it's not even giving me the option here because I didn't choose all apps. So let me just go back up and choose all apps. So there you can see we've got the options there of always persistent or never persistent. So this sort of goes through and sort of shows you just a bit more about it. But just more of those options that we've that have been added in. Okay, Eddie, thanks for joining, and we'll chat later. Now, just to sort of change gears a little bit here, and this is, I guess, what this next part is really we're going to just be recapping some of the things that I guess conditional access has, most of what we'll talk about, conditional access has actually done for a while. That's why it hasn't really been too much of a focus of this session. So the first thing here is AAD Security Defaults. Now, going back about 2 years, when Security Defaults was still in preview, it had a couple of different names, and at first all they were doing was giving people who didn't have Azure AD Premium the ability to go through and enable certain conditional access policies. So think of each of these items over here as conditional access policies that you could set up. So requiring everyone to register for MFA, requiring admins to use MFA when they're accessing services, blocking legacy auth, requiring users to perform MFA when needed. Now, in this case, they're careful with the wording about this one, but requiring users to perform MFA when necessary, that is risk-based sign-in. However, they can't say risk-based because then people go, does that mean I'm getting Azure AD Premium P2? Now, and so they sort of just say that, so it's not something that you've got any control over, and then protecting privileged access. Now, while these were in preview, you could turn them on or off individually. You couldn't target who they were applied to. You could only, it was basically turn this one on, this one off, etc. That was it. But then when it went from preview and eventually to GA, what happened there was it became a single switch of turn it on or turn it off. Now you can see here, just to get a screenshot, what I did here was I jumped into one where I've already got CA policy set up, just to show you that you can't use this alongside CA. You use this instead of CA. So if someone sets up a new tenant and they haven't quite figured out what CA policies they need to set up, it might be a good place to say, let's just turn this on and see what breaks. Okay, maybe that's not such a good idea. Like if it's a new tenant, they're not doing much. They're probably not going to be using legacy auth if it's a new tenant, etc. And steering people into MFA right from the beginning is a pretty good idea. But one of the challenges that you've got with these security defaults is it's all or nothing. So if you don't have conditional access through AAD Premium, you're turning all of these on or all of them off with that single switch. Now, by default, I think if someone is just setting up a new Azure AD tenant and just adding an Azure subscription, or let's say someone's setting up a new Azure subscription without any kind of O365 or M365, it seems like this is now just turned on by default. So within a short, so if you start creating new user accounts, etc., it's going to start prompting you to go through the MFA enrollment process pretty quickly. So Kwok, can you confirm it does it by default now, doesn't it? And I think it's different.
Yeah, all new tenants by default have it enabled.
So even O365 tenants.
Yep.
Okay, because that was the thing that I wasn't sure of. Because if it was just AAD free, where they enabled it by default, or as soon as you had any kind of anything from O365 AAD up, if they started changing the rules. What about if someone's got AAD Premium as part of it? Does it turn it on by default?
If they haven't created a policy, it will stay on. The minute you go and create a policy,
it'll say, hey, you need to turn this
off. The CA instead. That's right.
Okay, cool. Yes, okay, so that's,
as long as you don't touch anything, you're good.
Yeah, so the fact that they're calling it default is now telling the story. Whereas for a while it was called the defaults, but it wasn't actually on by default. You still had to, basically you had to opt in. But they gave enough notice saying, hey, at some point in the future, all new tenants will have this thing turned on. And it's not going to break anything because that tenant wasn't working to begin with.
That's right.
But I don't know if that's it's probably not the best wording, but yeah, it can't break something that has never worked before.
Yep.
But retroactively applying it to all existing tenants, that would be a problem. It would be an opportunity for learning. As long as you're not the one who has to be involved with it. Okay, now this is just to sort of wrap things up here. So I mentioned that there are some kind of common policy recommendations that you'll see from Microsoft, and I didn't actually find the page that I was originally looking for that had a lot of this kind of stuff on it, but I'm sure if I went digging, I'd be able to find it, because the page, where I pulled this from was more focused just on the CA side. But I'm pretty sure, and Kwok, you might know the one I'm talking about. So going back a couple of years, there was, I don't think it was Active Directory documentation. I think it was just more securing your environment documentation, where they kind of gave some templates for this is how you should be setting up conditional access policies to protect these types of workloads based on whether you're like highly secure org, or Slack or lax in security org. Do you know the docs? Do you know the guides that I'm talking about?
What's it specific to?
It was around conditional access, but it wasn't from the AA. It didn't seem like it was part of the AAD documentation. It was more of a protecting your M365 workloads with conditional access. And they were sort of breaking it into, here's how you'd protect, here are the kinds of policies you'd set up for teams, etc.
Oh, you're talking about the M365 golden config.
It might, I don't know what it was called, but I'll go back. So, because I should still have some of the links to it somewhere, but if you know the one I mean, or you can find it. But I think this does a lot of this, gives a lot of the same kinds of, that might be it. Let me just have a quick.
It was basically a best practice guide.
Yeah, that looks like, actually, no, it looks like it's been, yes, that's it.
It's been updated.
Yeah, very, very.
Goes through the different personas and that, yep.
Yeah, that's the one. Okay, so I'll actually keep that page, because I was trying to remember the name of it and I couldn't think of it. But now that I know what the AKA is, I should remember it. But if we just sort of start off by taking a look at the first four. So these first four, we effectively get these with security defaults. So security defaults is kind of like, here are the, here's the basic building blocks of what you need to do before you start deploying. But now there's what are the additional things you need to take into account. So first of all, if you've got AAD Premium P2, then you'll start seeing sign-in risk and user risk signed light up. But if you don't have AAD Premium P2, you won't see these. So if you've got Premium P1, it's not going to give you these as grayed out options. You just don't see them there at all. Now, some of the other things down here is, do you want to, if people are going to be registering for MFA, do you want to make sure that they're doing it from particular locations, for example? So just making sure things are more secure, blocking access by location, requiring compliant device. Now, the things that I've seen several times with this require compliant device is people getting really, really excited about it, but kind of forgetting something really important with it. So let's just take a quick look. Where are we? Yep, this one will do. So let's just create a new policy called compliant device. Now, probably the most important thing to remember here is that you can't choose all users unless you don't have any external users or guests coming in. Because with this one, that compliant device info is coming from your Intune tenant. And unless you are getting external parties to enroll their devices with your Intune tenant and you're buying the licenses, etc., for them, or maybe you're handing them those devices, you can't choose all users. Or you can, just be prepared for anyone outside of the org. So if someone says all users, all apps, I'm basically building a nightmare scenario here. Yeah, something like that, saying if you don't have a compliant device, and remember here, and this is one of the, I guess, was one of the really early bits where they really gave you a good idea of how tightly integrated some of the different M365 services was here. If you jump over to this required device to be marked as compliant, if you hover over that, it explicitly tells you it has to be Intune compliant. Now, the thing here that I guess they probably need to add in here is, Intune compliant as part of your tenant. So just be careful with that device one. If you've got external people coming in, you can't enforce device compliance. You've got to think about other ways to make sure. So maybe you need them to re-authenticate sooner, etc. Yeah, it's really up to you to figure out how to get that one in there. Now, what else? Block access except specific apps. So if someone only needs access to a few things, just give them access to a few things. So probably once you start doing things like the blocking and some of the different restrictions that you need to put in place, just making sure that you do get really comfortable with using what if, just to make sure you're not accidentally locking a ton of people out when you're ready to roll out a new policy. But at least now you know that you can roll back quickly if you need to. So that's pretty much the final one. So what I'll do is this should get processed tonight. I'll get it uploaded to YouTube, and each of the slides I've got the link out to the docs articles for each of the topics. So what I'll do is I'll get it when I get the recording uploaded. I'll go through and just drop in all of the links straight out to docs so that you can get straight into them from there, rather than having to go through and find it. And that means that anyone else who joins afterwards can get those URLs as well. And I'll drop in the ones that Fox been dropping in as well. Anything that doesn't overlap. So that's really the last slide. So I guess from here, let's sort of go into the next part, which is really just just the general Q&A side related to the topic. And then for anyone who's new, we have Q&A that's recorded, so generally things that are part of the conversation of what we've been talking about. But then if anyone does have questions that they want to ask or things that they just don't want to get recorded, like we also continue on after we stop recording the session. If you do have some things that you do want to sort of just do a quick check on something without it being permanently uploaded to YouTube. So I guess just opening it up now. Everyone's free to unmute or jump into the chat window just to either share their experiences or just while we've got everyone on the call, just to ask any questions. Oh, we have a question from Ben. Hi, Ben.
No, you don't have a question for me. It's more of a statement.
Yeah. I'll stop the recording.
All right, cool.